Builder of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, destroyer of Jerusalem, captor of the Hebrew people, mightier than Heracles. Nebuchadnezzar II is most well known from his portrayals in the Old Testament, but the Greeks also had their own stories to tell about him, and, unsurprisingly, neither of these narratives fit exactly with the evidence that exists from Mesopotamia. Who was Nebuchadnezzar II? Which story is fact, which is fiction, and which is a little bit of both? Like, subscribe, come along for the ride. Nebuchadnezzar II had the longest reign of any king in his dynasty, from 605 to 562 BCE, 43 years. We know about him from a wide variety of sources: royal inscriptions composed on his behalf, economic and administrative texts that were the apparatus of his empire, letters, chronicles, and the texts of other cultures, including the Old Testament and works of classical authors. There's far too much material for me to provide any kind of comprehensive survey in a 10-minute video, so we're going to focus on the main sources that make up his image today: his royal inscriptions and the Mesopotamian chronicles, the Hebrew Bible or Old Testament, and the works of Hellenistic writers. All of these sources have their own quirks and foibles, as well as reasons for and against their use. As with every single piece of historical evidence, they were all created for specific uses that impact how they portray Nebuchadnezzar. Understanding those uses will help us to understand the sometimes conflicting accounts of this king's reign. First, a bit of background. As I said, Nebuchadnezzar II had a 43-year reign, something that is notable for this time in history. He was the second king of the Neo-Babylonian dynasty and son of Nabopolassar, who ruled from 626 to 605 BCE. The origins of the dynasty are somewhat obscure, but Nabopolassar openly recorded that he was not of royal origins. He most likely held an important political position in the southern Mesopotamian city of Uruk, and for some reason rebelled against the Assyrian kings who ruled there. Nebuchadnezzar held the position of high priest at the Temple of Eanna and was also in command of his father's army prior to his accession to the throne. As prince and then king, he carried out numerous military campaigns in a variety of foreign lands, defeating the Egyptian pharaoh Necho and campaigning also against Elam and various nomadic groups. He also had to contend with a rebellion in Babylon. Most famously, Nebuchadnezzar was responsible for the capture of Jerusalem and the deportation of its population back to Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar II was also a prolific builder, constructing or renovating religious and civic constructions, including the famous walls of Babylon. The sources for his reign are, as I've said, tricky. The cuneiform record is incomplete, and the Greek and Latin sources can be difficult to interpret for various reasons, not least of which is because we have few of them in their original form. Rather, they are often quoted in the work of later authors. Nebuchadnezzar also appears frequently in the Hebrew Bible, which is often used to fill the latter half of his reign in. None of these sources should be taken at face value. Let's start with the two main sources from Mesopotamia: royal inscriptions and the chronicles. The practice of recording royal accomplishments by inscribing them on various objects had a long tradition in Mesopotamia, going back almost as far as the invention of cuneiform. The practice, naturally, varied over its almost 4,000-year history, but in very general terms, the kings of Assyria in the north preferred to record their military exploits, while the Babylonian kings in the south were more likely to record their building activities, which gives you an interesting snapshot on the different roles and responsibilities of Mesopotamian kings. Nebuchadnezzar's inscriptions firmly follow the Babylonian tradition, recording in great detail his building accomplishments. In the words of Deriva, the royal inscriptions of Nebuchadnezzar hardly contain any reference to political or military events. Their topic is mainly the king as builder of temples, defensive constructions and palaces, and the king as restorer of rituals and cultic ordinances. Many of his building projects were focused on the city of Babylon, though other regional centers were by no means neglected. Prolific, even by the standards of Babylonian kings, Nebuchadnezzar carried out both civic and religious building programs, including the famous walls of Babylon and a magnificent palace with a rooftop garden that may have been the fact behind the fiction of the Hanging Gardens. He also renovated and rebuilt many temples, including the Atem and Anki, the ziggurat of Marduk, that may have inspired the biblical Tower of Babel. These inscriptions highlight the piety of the king in his efforts to bring glory to the gods through his building programs, and his status as a divinely chosen ruler. They most definitely gloss over his military activities. The military campaigns of Nebuchadnezzar II are really only mentioned in a selection of texts known as the chronicles. These are, generally speaking, chronologically arranged lists of events, often with some brief explanation. Chronicles concentrate on chronology, checking off reign after reign, year after year, the long scheme of events deemed worthy of remembrance. They are usually incomplete, but still provide us with excellent historiographical information. The beginning of Nebuchadnezzar II's reign is covered in Chronicle 5 of the Babylonian Chronicle series. The chronicle covers, among other things, Nebuchadnezzar's military campaigns in the Levant while he was still crown prince, his defeat of Egyptian forces under the command of Pharaoh Necho, and, most famously, the capture of Jerusalem. Unfortunately, the chronicle breaks off in the 11th year of Nebuchadnezzar's 43-year reign, leaving us with a bit of a gap. However, the picture that we get from the chronicle is very different to that provided by the royal inscriptions. Rather than building activity and cultic work, the chronicle primarily records military campaigns, rebellions, and the imposition of tribute upon other nations. Some exceptions exist. For example, obverse line 14 records Nebuchadnezzar celebrating the 𝒀:HTU festival, but generally, the picture painted by the chronicles is one of a military ruler. Now, before I get started on the non-Mesopotamian material, I should stress that I'm not a biblicist or a classicist. The material contained in the rest of the video is not terribly familiar to me. Undoubtedly, there are some nuances that I will be unaware of, and, as such, you should take this as a rough guideline only. The most famous non-native source that provides a record of Nebuchadnezzar II is the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. Nebuchadnezzar is an important figure in various sections of the Old Testament, and his appearances are both more or less historically accurate and completely fictitious. This doesn't make the Old Testament more or less reliable than any other historical source. You just, as with everything, have to be mindful of what you're reading and why it was written. 1st and 2nd Kings, originally one book, are historical books within the Old Testament that narrate the history of the Israelite monarchy from the end of King David's reign through to the Babylonian exile. As with much historical writing from the ancient world, the earliest events recorded may be less factually correct than the later events, as the later events were closer in time to the life of the writer. Luckily for us, the reign of Nebuchadnezzar is one of the last sections of the book. Unsurprisingly, the material contained in Kings focuses on the actions of Nebuchadnezzar as they impacted the Israelite people. His campaigns against Jerusalem and the Babylonian exile all feature largely, and although the Babylonian evidence is scant when compared to the accounts in Kings, some of the details can be confirmed by the cuneiform sources. For example, Jehoiakim's exile to Babylon is attested in cuneiform documentation that name the Israelite king and 5 of his sons as recipients of food rations. The appointment of Jehoiakim's uncle, Mattaniah, later Zedekiah, as a vassal ruler by Nebuchadnezzar is also referenced in the Mesopotamian chronicles, which report that the Babylonian king appointed there a king of his choice. The other main biblical source for Nebuchadnezzar is the Book of Daniel. However, this provides us with no actual information as to the historical figure of the king of Babylon. Though Daniel is set during the Babylonian exile, an historical event that occurred during Nebuchadnezzar's reign, the Book of Daniel itself is more concerned with using the setting of Babylon and the character of its king to illustrate the superiority of the Israelite God and the figure of Daniel. The character of Nebuchadnezzar in the Book of Daniel is only tangentially related to the historical king, and many of the more famous episodes in the biblical text are actually based on the actions of an entirely different king, a later king in the Neo-Babylonian dynasty named Nabonidus. For example, the 7-year absence of the king from Babylon, as recorded in chapter 4 of Daniel, is actually based on Nabonidus' 10-year self-imposed exile to Tamar in Arabia, while the idol worship in chapter 3 of Daniel may be a reference to Nabonidus' unpopular favourable treatment of the moon god Sin over and above Marduk, the god of Babylon. We also hear about Nebuchadnezzar II from Greek authors, and one Babylonian scholar writing for a Greek audience. As with the chronicles, the majority of these texts are known only from later copies, which can be incredibly frustrating. The one text we do have a complete copy of is The Antiquity of the Jews by Josephus Flavius, a Roman Jewish historian from Jerusalem who lived during the 1st century CE. The Antiquity of the Jews contains the history of the Jewish people, apparently compiled for the elucidation of a Greco-Roman audience. Much of the text is essentially a rewriting or paraphrasing of the Old Testament, starting with the creation of the world and ending with the First Jewish-Roman War, which took place in the early 1st century CE. As it draws heavily from the Old Testament, Nebuchadnezzar II is a recurring figure. The activities of Nebuchadnezzar are dealt with in Book 10, chapters 6 to 11. As with much of the biblical account, Nebuchadnezzar's military campaigns in the Levant are the main focus of the narrative, including his war with the Egyptian pharaoh Necho, his campaigns against Jerusalem, and the Babylonian captivity. As Josephus draws so strongly on the Old Testament, there is little value in further exploration of his work, except to say that he also quotes sections of texts from other historians. In fact, Josephus is an excellent source for texts that no longer exist as a whole, including 𝑒rosus Babyloniaca and Megisthenes Indica. These are quoted in Book 10, Chapter 11 of the Antiquity of the Jews. 𝑒rosus was a Babylonian priest who lived during the 3rd century BCE. He was probably a member of the Seleucid court and wrote the Babylonica to help inform the Greek world of Babylonian history. Apparently an unpopular work, only fragments of it survive, but those fragments show that he probably had a traditional Mesopotamian scribal education and was additionally able to write Greek. 𝑒rosus' account of Nebuchadnezzar II was originally found in Book 3 of the Babylonica, which covered the history of Babylon from Nebuchadnezzar to Alexander the Great. His account of Nebuchadnezzar is brief, but mentions both his military conquests and his building projects, describing how the king used the spoils of war to enhance the temples of Babylon. Another section of 𝑒rosus' work, recorded in Josephus' text Against Apion, apparently described the Babylonian exile of the Jewish people and explained how Nebuchadnezzar conquered Egypt, Syria, Phoenicia, and Arabia. A slight exaggeration here, as while Nebuchadnezzar did defeat the Egyptians in battle and then invaded Egypt, it was never conquered and incorporated into the Neo-Babylonian Empire. 𝑒rosus went into some detail describing how Nebuchadnezzar constructed the new walls of Babylon and created a new palace in only 15 days. This palace apparently contained the Hanging Garden, which 𝑒rosus says Nebuchadnezzar created for his wife, as she was homesick for her mountainous birthplace. After he had walled the city in notable fashion and adorned its gates in a manner befitting a holy place, he built another palace next to the palace of his father. Despite its extraordinary size and splendor, however, it was completed in 15 days. In this palace he built and arranged the so-called Hanging Garden by setting up high stone terraces which he made appear very similar to mountains, planted with all kinds of trees. He did this because his wife, who had been raised in Media, longed for mountainous surroundings. While the built a palace in 15 days thing is clearly an exaggeration, Nebuchadnezzar did indeed build a magnificent palace, as well as new city walls and gates at the city of Babylon. The Summer Palace is described in a building inscription: a building to be admired by the people, a linking point of the land, a gleaming sanctuary, my royal abode. While the glazed, decorative bricks of the Ishtar Gate are some of the most famous artifacts from Nebuchadnezzar's reign. Josephus also quotes a Greek man named Megisthenes, who was an ambassador to India during the late 3rd and early 2nd century CE. As with 𝑒rosus, little of his work survives, and that which is known to modern scholars is found in the writings of other ancient authors. Megisthenes recorded that Nebuchadnezzar's military campaigns extended as far as the Straits of Gibraltar, and that he subjugated Libya and Spain, and on top of that he relocated Spanish populations to the Near East. This somewhat fantastic record of achievements is a greatly exaggerated version of Nebuchadnezzar's military prowess, and it's been argued that this storytelling was a direct result of the fertile myth-making at the court of Alexander the Great, whose advisors were able to create quasi-historical figures who provided a record of achievement for him to emulate and surpass. As magnificent a military mind as Nebuchadnezzar was, making it all the way to Spain, even he was unable to conquer India, making Alexander the Great's achievements all the more noteworthy. The final Greek writer that I'm including is Herodotus, mainly because you can't talk about Greek historiography without mentioning him. Herodotus lived during the 4th century BCE, and his book The Histories looks at the origins of the Greco-Persian Wars. Herodotus describes the city of Babylon in some detail, including the walls of the city, which he described as wide enough that a 4-horse chariot could be driven along the top. The ziggurat dedicated to Marduk is also described, as is the process of making bricks out of clay. While the size of the walls is obviously exaggerated, and it's highly unlikely that Herodotus ever visited Babylon himself, the splendour of the city, thanks in no small part to the building endeavours of Nebuchadnezzar, was clearly famous in antiquity. So, what has this overview shown us? First, that no single source of information will provide a complete account of any historical person, period, or event. If we used only Nebuchadnezzar's inscriptions, we'd view the king purely as a pious builder, mainly because that's how he wished to be seen. If we used the Old Testament, then we'd see an arrogant, despotic military commander, because that image best suited the aims of the Old Testament writers. The later Greek sources attempted to be more historical, but as they couldn't access the cuneiform records and were writing several hundred years after the events they recorded, their portrayal is by no means complete or accurate. Second, we've seen that the achievements of Nebuchadnezzar continued to be recorded and talked about long after the fall of the Neo-Babylonian dynasty. His building program at Babylon created a truly spectacular city that later writers spoke of in awe, with features that we still marvel at today. Likewise, his reputation as a military commander was remembered long after his death, and was spun into a semi-divine attribute that rivaled the achievements of Heracles, which in turn could only be overcome in the Greek imagination by those achievements of Alexander the Great. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it and maybe learned something new. If you'd like to suggest a video or help choose a topic for our next video, please consider joining our Patreon at www.patreon.com/Digital Hammurabi.